Welcome everyone to our last panel session of the day, Practical Deep Learning, how it is used in production and already revolutionizing enterprise work. I'm excited to introduce our speaker and my classmate and friend from MIT undergrad, Sam Udatong. Sam is the co-founder and CTO of Firefly's AI. So good to see you again, Sam, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Hope everyone has had a good day so far and happy to close this out. Today, I want to talk about practical deep learning, and I really want to talk about it from the perspective of a startup, looking at how do you build models and get them into production, get them out to users and actually integrate it into your company. And so I want to talk about it from that lens instead of thinking about the research and the theory as much, but more about how would you do it yourself. So a little bit of background about myself. I'm Sam. I was MIT 2016, where I studied aerospace and computer science. And I graduated, moved out directly to San Francisco with my co-founder, Krish, to work on Fireflies. We actually spent the first 3 years out here bootstrapping, trying to save as much money as possible, eating Soylent and Domino's pizza and saving money. And then last year, we raised our seed round, which was a $5 million round. And so I want to talk about what we're doing and then give you some background, because that'll lead you to how we can think about deep learning from a startup's perspective. So Fireflies, what we're doing at Fireflies is we're building an AI that joins meetings and takes notes automatically. And the way that works is pretty interesting. So this is the problem that we're addressing. And this is my schedule literally every week, most weeks, and it's meetings back to back to back to back. And when I'm hopping from meeting 1 to meeting 2, it's hard to even remember just back an hour to remember what I was talking about. So me and Krish are like super lazy, and we're like, what can we do to automate this problem? What if we had an assistant that could join those meetings for us and take notes so that we could focus on the conversation and on not having to miss anything because we were not as diligent. So we decided to design Fred. And Fred is an AI assistant. We wanted to really focus on making it simple, easy to use, easy to understand, because ultimately we want to provide the users with a good experience. And they don't necessarily care about, what is the technology behind it. They just want the end result. They want it to be easy. And so with that in mind, we designed an assistant, Fred, and we made it simple. And all you have to do is invite Fred at fireflies.ai to your meetings, and he'll take notes for you. And so when Fred joins your conference, just like a Zoom conference like this one, or a Google Meet or WebEx, Fireflies is able to transcribe that audio, save the audio, and then provide it to you after the meeting within 10 minutes, and give you the notes, give you the action items, and let you look at what you have. And so this is what the product looks like today. After the meeting, you get the full record of your conversations. And I've actually been recording my conversations for the past 2 years. And so now I have a dashboard where I can search back to any conversation I've had, whether it's a recruiting call, hiring an engineer, and then going back 6 months later to see what were our hesitations and what were our excitements, and did those actually come true, or whether it's a sales call where we're trying to figure out what did the best reps say when they were closing the deal. And then we want to actually be able to surface those action items at any time, and then go a step further and actually send those action items directly into the systems where you work today. So if you're, if you recognize that an action item said, hey, I'm going to finish this deck for you by next week, we can put that in Trello automatically and close the loop between where you communicate and where you work. And so for Fireflies, we think about it in 2 big categories. We have these systems of communication like Zoom, Google Meet, Uber Conference, and we have these systems of work like Salesforce, HubSpot, Trello, Slack, where you work in every day. And today, those systems are not connected. You'll have amazing conversations, and you'll be communicating, but there's no way to actually automatically link that. Instead, you have to do a lot of manual labor to get that data into your systems. So Salesforce, for example, is really at a high level, it's a spreadsheet. It's a spreadsheet of your customer data that you have to make sure that you're going in and updating every single day. But what if you were able to have those customer profiles automatically updated just when you converse? So that's really the mission that we're taking on with Fireflies. And I want to show you how we like translated that mission to, tangible considerations and the different challenges and things that we've learned on the journey. So yeah, I think now we can hop into what makes up these deep learning models, how we're actually able to turn those calls into summaries. And so here is a high-level view of what we're doing. You get voice data and you want to turn it into text. How do you do that? Thankfully today, the technology that's available has let even just one or two engineers build out deep learning that's equivalent to what it would have taken 10 PhDs to do just 5 years ago. And so with this democratization of technology, you're able to really, at a high level, understand how you can translate the data without needing to know all of the theory that a PhD would know. And so I want to kind of show you how that works. In 3 big steps, we kind of have, how do you collect your data? How do you pick the model that you want to use? And then how do you actually ensure that it's performing well and mapping to business results? And so in the remainder of the presentation, I'm going to dive into some of these areas. And I would say that one thing to take away at the end is that the data collection step actually ends up being one of the most important considerations and one of the most time-consuming things to do that will actually inform your model's predictions rather than knowing the rest of the stuff. So here is what we consider when we're thinking about collecting data. And really the magic is when you're able to build your initial data set and then continuously add to that from your existing strengths in your business. So what I mean by that is when we started Fireflies, we actually recorded our own conversations and spent an all-nighter manually labeling 20,000 data points. So me and my co-founder would just click yes, no, yes, no. Is this important or is this not important? And we built a binary classification model that was able to predict what notes we want from our own conversations. And then we rolled that out to the first initial set of users. And then from there, we were able to set up a loop where every transcript that gets sent to a user, we take the feedback from that and then put it back into our machine learning model in terms of the data input that goes in. So when you are thinking about your data and your business, you want to think about where can you take advantage of how your business operates to store this data into either spreadsheets or databases, and then how do you ensure that the labels are really accurate? So you can either look at signals from your users, or if you don't have that, you can go and check out tools like Crowdflower or Scale API, which can help you with data labeling as well. And spending a lot more time on this step and ensuring that the quality of the input is good will save you a lot of time later. And so here's an example of ensuring something that you would do to ensure that the quality of the data is good. You might have a giant spreadsheet or a giant table, and sometimes you'll end up with duplicate results. And so you can use things as basic as Excel, where you can find patterns in your data and ensure that you have no conflicting labels, you have no duplicate records, that in our case, sentences have no unexpected characters, because those minor problems will actually end up being a bigger challenge to getting your model into production. So the way that we look at it is, instead of trying to worry about what is the perfect model to do, instead it's much more time efficient to figure out how can I make my data set as good as possible? Because ultimately the goal is to get from A to B. You want to have an input data set, and then you want to get an output prediction. And the way we like to think about it is, it's almost like when you're trying to get from point A to point B, like traveling. If you're thinking about how to do that, you might build a skateboard first, and then you might build a car, and then you might build a plane. But the end result is, how do you get from A to B? And so starting up with something simple, getting from A to B, and then iterating on that means of transportation is kind of analogous to how we always recommend going about building AI in production. So again, here is an example of completing that data loop where when we send users the summary, and this is the graphic from before, we're able to feed out the results and complete the loop and send the metadata back into the system to improve the results for next time. And so now we have, like in the beginning, we started off with just 20,000 points that informed our model, but now we have millions of users that are using Fireflies in their meetings, and we are able to feed the data back in to improve the model for next time. And so thinking really critically about the data step and how do you complete this loop, or how do you get those labels as accurate and as well as you can actually be a much more indicative thing that leads you to success rather than worrying about the inner steps. But speaking of the inner steps, once you are happy with your data setup, how do you actually then start running models? And thinking about it like from a beginner standpoint, I highly recommend to just literally look up image classification, GitHub, open source on Google, and you'll end up finding models that are 100 lines of code that can actually predict what images are, or models that are very easy to understand and easy to set up that can do binary classification. And so I always recommend start from a template and just make sure it works first, and then you can go and iterate on that. In this process, the goal will be to make sure that your data fits the model that you find, and then fixing any errors. But again, once you get from A to B, you'll be able to iterate much faster. And then you have a bunch of options with open source tools today, which is amazing. And I actually, every year that passes, there's a lot more availability of things that you can do to make machine learning easier. And at this rate, it really looks like in the next 5 years, we're going to see platforms where you can actually set up models without writing code at all. Instead, you'll be able to just communicate with those systems either through UI or otherwise, and then be able to output amazing results. One example is a tool called SIGOPT, where it lets you test different input parameters very quickly. So maybe you set up a model, but you didn't know the perfect parameters to pick. You can kind of put those parameters into SIGOPT and then run a Bayesian optimization on the input space automatically through this tool, and it'll give you the most optimal parameters given your prediction that you're looking for. And so I would recommend taking advantage of what's out there today to save a lot of time so that you don't have to go and reinvent the wheel. Here's an example of Paperspace, which is a GPU in the cloud. This is interesting because you can run highly intensive models without right from your computer without burdening your system. I experienced this problem myself because I used to run models on my computer, then my keys would literally start burning my fingers as I was typing, which was really painful. But I realized that you can easily set up computers in the cloud and run models there. So that's another resource to check out. And then finally, how do you actually ensure once you have your data set up and you've picked your model, you've iterated a little bit, you've optimized your parameters, how do you actually ensure that the predictions that you're outputting are actually driving your business forward? And so you can even if you generate like a 99% accurate model on whatever your data set is, that might not actually map to user success. So it's important to really tie the AI metrics in terms of F1 score, false positives, false negatives, false and true positives and negatives, to what is actually driving your business success. And I would also say that since this is such a new field, you should feel open to experimentation in terms of testing out different things and going outside of what's already accepted. And then obviously the field is changing really quickly. So here's a couple of other resources to follow along. Most recently, even just today, there's been some amazing talk on GPT-3. And so, making sure that you're keeping up with the trends can also help you continue to iterate over time. But if you have the core where you're able to go from A to B, you can much more easily switch that out as necessary. And then here is an example of how you can map the model's success to your business KPIs. So the idea here is that if you can track how your model outputs versus how your, let's say, retention improves over time, then you can actually have a much more clear signal. And so I would recommend like setting up graphs that automatically track those two metrics and seeing them side by side. And a tool that you can use is Grafana, which can help you do that. So takeaways from this is that the input data, if you're going to take away one thing, is that the input data set is really going to be the biggest bottleneck to, providing your users with a good experience. And so you should think about the different ways that you can use your strengths and your advantages to set yourself up for success. And then finally, going back to the higher level, in the last 10 years, we've seen the emergence of tools that have been built on the machine learning, the back of the machine learning community, where even at big companies, you have these conversational assistants that you can talk to and they can answer questions about your day. They can finally understand you better than you could manually code. And now that these consumer tools have been out, in the next 10 years, we're going to see that this technology making its way into the enterprise, where you'll be able to communicate with your voice to your business. And you'll be able to ask questions like, who were the salespeople last month that sold the best? And what did they say to close the most deals? How did that map to the revenue that we made? You'll be able to, ask, what do I have pending on my list? Did I promise anything last week that I forgot about? And the enablement of the technology today is going to lead to interesting applications, especially if it continues to develop at the pace that it is, and more access is given to people who are like myself, who are able to do the work of 10 PhDs in just a couple hours. Really, we're going to see an explosion of AI and voice in the next 10 years. So thank you. Happy to answer questions, and feel free to reach out at any time.
Thanks so much, Sam. That was super interesting. I think a lot of people are really interested in your work. Can you tell us a little bit more about your bootstrapping experiences and how you managed the business in the first phases of the company and kind of the evolution until now?
Yeah. It's such a long story. So we actually started off back at MIT, was the first version of Fireflies. We started off as a food delivery service on MIT campus. And that was when I met my co-founder. We started off like at a hackathon, really. And then when we graduated, we decided to move out to the Bay Area and continue to iterate on the business. The first 3 years were a huge grind. And, literally every week I would have 2 boxes of Domino's pizza and a bottle of Soylent every single day to save money. And we would hop around between free like office spaces. And we ended up building a fully remote team. And we found our way to product market fit by focusing on how do you actually provide something that people want, people will pay for. And yeah, that's what led us to Fireflies. And since we ended up raising our seed round last year, but we've been building the product for quite some time.
That's awesome. I definitely remember the Domino's and Soylent phase.
I still actually have a bottle of Soylent right here that I've been
nice, very on brand. So kind of talking about the business, how do you drive customer adoption and sales at your current point right now?
Yeah, for us, it's interesting because meetings are a naturally viral system. And so when Fireflies joins a Zoom call like this, you'll actually see something that says Fireflies note taker. After the meeting, you can choose to send the notes to people on the call. And so when people see those notes, they end up wanting Fireflies in their meetings as well. So today we actually have 0 salespeople. We just have been growing from mostly word of mouth. Yeah, we're lucky to be in a space that obviously is much more important with COVID and the recent changes. So we've seen a lot of growth in the past 3-4 months as well.
Yeah, speaking of COVID, how do you manage very domain-specific terminologies and jargon, such as in healthcare, across multiple industries? And do you have to segment your models by industry to really gain traction?
Yeah, so we leave as much as possible up to the algorithm to decide how to analyze the results, but we provide the context to the algorithm as so when a user signs up, they pick their domain. They might pick healthcare, they might pick sales, they might pick recruiting. And then we also track the edits that they're making on their transcript, and also, the keywords that they've set up in our dashboard or on the meeting agenda. And so with that, you're able to get a lot of industry-specific jargon without having to manually do anything. And so when we think about like deep learning, this is like the first time in history where you're able to provide not just industry-specific models, but models that are specific to companies, company jargon, and even your individual personal jargon. Like I've seen that Fireflies, when it generates notes for me, it's actually has learned how I speak. In the beginning, it didn't. It actually had really terrible results, but now it almost gets my speech perfect. And ultimately, that's a result of completing that data loop, which is possible today.
That's awesome. And then the next question is, I think a lot of companies, similar companies, kind of deal with this issue of how do you balance the needs for data privacy versus training the models?
Yeah, that privacy is something that we think about every single day at Fireflies, and that is ultimately going to be the result of a couple of different things. Firstly, we try to make sure that the algorithm is running on only the context that you provided, and so ultimately, like, we're building software, and the user is in full control of their data. We will never sell it. We don't have access to it. But when it comes to the algorithm itself running, it needs to know the words that you're using. But there are some really interesting developments right now where you're able to run models without even seeing the language itself by using schemes that can basically encrypt the data, run the model on the encrypted data, produce results that are also encrypted that a third party couldn't understand, and then only the user, when they decrypt that key, can get the data back, and that's called homomorphic encryption. And so we're seeing that it's not in production yet in most applications today, but that's the future of ultimate privacy that we're building towards every day.
Awesome. I think we have time for one more question, and so I can actually vouch for Fireflies. My company uses it, and we've had a lot of great customer feedback. And we're curious, or a bunch of people are curious, what is your vision for future iterations of Fireflies, and what do you see as a broader use case for speech to text?
Yeah, I think beyond, so today Fireflies joins your meetings, generates notes, records the audio, lets you search back to any conversation you've ever had. But in the future, we see Fireflies as being a tool that you can use to get work done right from when you speak. So if you're in a meeting and you're saying, hey, I think we should schedule a meeting again for next weekend, I'll shoot you an email with the follow-up details. Firefly should be able to do that instantly, right, during the meeting, so that you don't have to go back 3 hours later and try to remember the context. And so I think with the availability of AI and plugging the different workflows in your business, and connecting those together, we're going to see the ability to use your voice to actually automate a lot of the things that take up a lot of manual pain every day. And so that's the direction that we're pushing towards, and we're pretty excited about that.
That's awesome. I have one last quick question for you. So who are the people who inspire you in AI? I guess who are your influencers, as some may say?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's some amazing companies out there that are doing some great work. I would say more than like individual. I mean, I got my start from listening to Stanford lectures. Richard, who spoke earlier today, is actually one of my is inspirational to me. And then there's also really awesome companies in the space that are doing interesting AI work, like Drift, Deepgram, and so also OpenAI, of course. And I think following along in the industry and even just reading what's going on is always exciting, and it's an honor to be here today.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time and insightful presentation today, Sam. It was good to catch up. And thank you to everyone for joining us today on the 4th day of the MIT AI conference.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Our next part of the conference is the AI